A poor girl is selling oranges at a traffic light, holding a handmade sign. When a young billionaire CEO approaches, she cries out, "Help me, please, I need to pay for my mum's surgery." As he looks at the photo she's holding, he recognizes the face of his ex-wife and is shocked. The grey sky over New York City seemed to mirror Blake Hamilton's mood on that fall morning. Despite being 38 years old and having a fortune estimated in the billions, there was a void no business acquisition could ever fill. Blake adjusted his cashmere coat, an unconscious habit whenever he was nervous, and continued his solitary walk. 3 years ago, he had adopted this strange ritual. Once a month, he would dismiss his driver and walk through the city's less affluent neighborhoods. His advisors thought it was an eccentricity, a billionaire wandering narrow alleys, observing lives so distant from his own reality. But to Blake, these walks were like an anchor keeping him connected to the real world, far from boardrooms and private jets. "Maybe it's just guilt," he murmured to himself as he turned a corner on the Lower East Side. The smell of street food mingled with the cold morning air, creating a familiar yet oddly comforting atmosphere. That was when his eyes caught a flash of bright orange across the street. A small makeshift stall, built from wooden crates, displayed several oranges arranged in neat piles. Behind them stood a girl who looked no older than 6, carefully organizing the fruit with meticulous attention. Blake couldn't explain what drew him to that particular scene. Maybe it was the contrast of the dark, curly-haired child against the city's grey backdrop, or perhaps the fact that she was there alone, selling fruit on a Thursday morning when she should have been in school. He crossed the street almost without thinking. As he approached, he noticed a hand-lettered sign with bright, uneven letters only a child could have made. "Help my mum, please. She needs surgery." The girl looked up when he drew nearer. She had large, expressive eyes, a vivid green that seemed to light up her delicate face. "Hi, mister," she said in a thin, clear voice. "Want to buy some oranges?" "They're really sweet." Blake noticed something familiar in her accent, a cadence he recognized quite well. "Hello?" he replied with a kind smile, crouching down so he was at her level. "Why aren't you in school today?" The girl bit her lower lip, a gesture that gave Blake a strange sense of déjà vu. "Mommy's sick, really sick. Today she couldn't get out of bed," the child explained with a seriousness that didn't match her age. "So I came to sell oranges. I need to save money." There was a dignity in that small figure that made Blake's chest tighten. Children shouldn't have to carry such heavy burdens. "How much are your oranges?" he asked, and pulling out his wallet. "3 for $5, she answered promptly, her eyes gleaming with hope. "But if you buy more, I can give you a discount." Blake smiled. "I'll take them all." The girl's eyes widened in surprise and suspicion. "All of them?" "All," he confirmed. "How much for the entire stock?" The child furrowed her brow, clearly doing some complicated mental math. "I have 34 oranges, she finally said. That would be, let's say $60, Blake suggested, knowing it was far more than their actual worth. The girl nodded vigorously, her curls bouncing. "Wow, that's a lot of money," she exclaimed with genuine admiration. "It's gonna help my mum a lot." Blake took a few bills from his wallet and handed them to the child. She accepted them carefully, as though they were made of glass. "I won't be able to carry all the oranges right now," he explained, "but you can keep them and sell them to other people." The little vendor looked at him curiously. "You don't want the oranges, but you're paying for them." Blake felt a twinge of tenderness at her confusion. "Let's just say it's my contribution to help your mother." The girl's face lit up with a smile that could melt even the coldest heart. "Thank you, mister. My name's Isla. What's yours?" "Blake," he answered, surprising himself by offering his real name. "Does your mum have something serious?" Isla's smile vanished quickly, replaced by a solemn expression. "Yes, she needs an operation, but it's really expensive. She says she'll get better, but I know that's not true." The child's sharp intuition was as impressive as it was heartbreaking. "Can I show you a picture of her?" Isla asked, already reaching into the pocket of her worn coat. "She was so pretty before she got sick." Blake nodded, more out of politeness than genuine interest. The girl pulled out a creased photo and held it out proudly. In that instant, time seemed to freeze. The air caught in Blake's lungs, and his heart skipped a beat. His eyes couldn't stray from the image. A woman with wavy brown hair and a radiant smile looked at the camera. The same green eyes as the little girl, the same smile he knew so well. It was Claire Bennett, his Claire. The woman he had loved more than anything, who vanished from his life nearly 7 years ago. "This is your mum?" Blake asked, his voice trembling, trying to mask his shock. Isla nodded proudly. "She's pretty, right? This picture is from before she got sick. Now she's skinnier, and some of her hair fell out." Blake struggled to remain composed, but his mind was racing, trying to process the information. Claire was sick, needing surgery, living in dire conditions with this child. A child who must be around 6 years old. 6 years since. A terrible equation started forming in his mind. "Does your mum live around here?" he asked, attempting to sound casual. "Yes, on Orchard Street," Isla said, vaguely pointing toward the end of the block. "It's the red building with the broken door." Blake handed the photo back with slightly shaking hands. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Who's looking after your mum now?" "Our neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, checks on her at lunchtime. But soon I have to go back and give her medicine." Blake felt the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. He looked at the child again, now noticing details he hadn't seen before. The color of her eyes, the shape of her chin, the way she furrowed her brow when thinking. "Isla," he asked carefully, "how old are you?" 6.5, she replied proudly, showing her fingers. "I had my birthday last month." 6.5. The timing fit perfectly. "Do you need to get back home now?" he asked, trying to organize his swirling thoughts. "Not yet. Mom said I should stay here until I sell at least 10 oranges. But since you bought them all," she smiled, revealing a missing front tooth, "I guess I can go back now." Blake saw an opportunity. "Can I walk with you to your street? It can be dangerous out here." Isla seemed to think about the offer for a moment, her small face assuming a serious expression. "Mom told me not to go off with strangers, but you don't seem bad. And you bought all my oranges," she added, as if that alone proved his good character. "Okay, you can walk with me, but only to the corner of my street." Blake helped her pack the oranges into a faded cloth bag she had brought. Isla tucked the money into the inner pocket of her coat, patting it to make sure it was secure. "All set," she announced with an adorable seriousness. "We can go." As they walked side by side along the uneven sidewalk, Blake struggled to keep his emotions under control. If his suspicions were correct, this child walking beside him might be... No, he didn't dare complete the thought. It was too terrifying, too wonderful, too devastating. "Do you like ice cream, Isla?" he asked, trying to maintain casual conversation. "I love it," her eyes lit up, "but I only get it on special occasions. Mom says it's expensive." Another stab of pain pierced Blake's chest. The idea that this child considered ice cream a luxury was unbearable. "And your dad? Does he help you and your mom?" Isla's face turned suddenly serious. "I don't have a dad. At least not one I know. Mom never talks about him." Blake swallowed hard. The knot in his throat felt the size of a tennis ball. "Sometimes," Isla continued thoughtfully, "I imagine what he'd be like. Maybe he died, or maybe he lives really far away. Or maybe..." She paused, looking at Blake with innocent curiosity. "Maybe he's like you. Like me." Blake almost tripped over a crack in the sidewalk. "Yes, someone nice, who helps people and buys all the oranges, even though he doesn't really want to take any." She smiled at him again, revealing the gap where her tooth was missing. Blake felt his eyes sting. He blinked rapidly to push back the tears that threatened to form. After a few minutes, they reached a narrower street. Isla pointed to a red brick building at the end of the block. The facade was peeling, and several windows were either broken or patched with tape. The front door, as Isla had described one was partially broken, held shut by a rusty chain. "That's where I live," she said. "On the 3rd floor." Blake looked at the building with barely concealed horror. How could Claire be living there? How could this child call that place home? "You can leave me here," Isla said, stopping at the corner as they'd agreed. Thanks for walking with me, Mr. Blake. You're welcome, Ela, he replied, reluctant to let her go. Are you sure you'll be okay? Of course, she answered with the confidence only children have. I live here. I know everyone. Blake hesitated, seized by an almost irresistible urge to follow her inside, to see Claire with his own eyes, to demand answers. But the shock was still too great. He needed time to process what he had discovered. Isla, he began, not quite sure what to say. Take care, all right? And tell your mom I hope she gets better soon. I will, she promised, waving before turning and running toward the broken door. Blake remained standing at the corner, watching until the small figure disappeared inside. Then, as if propelled by an invisible force, he circled the block and approached the building from another angle, where he could observe without being seen. The third floor. Isla had said they lived on the third floor. Blake counted the windows, trying to guess which one might be theirs. One of the windows on the third floor had a small plant on the ledge, a single cactus in a makeshift soda can pot. Claire always loved plants, even the toughest, most improbable ones. He waited, watching. After a few minutes, he saw Isla appear at that very window. She placed something on the ledge, what looked like the money he'd given her, and then disappeared from view. Blake remained there for almost an hour, unmoving, ignoring the growing cold as the afternoon wore on. He saw Isla appear at the window twice more, once holding what looked like a glass of water, and another time just looking out at the street, as if searching for something or someone. The pain in his chest felt almost physical. Guilt, regret, confusion, and above all, anger at himself churned inside him like a storm threatening to knock him down. Claire was sick, possibly dying, living in miserable conditions, and that child, Isla, could it really be? The math fit, the timing made perfect sense, and those eyes, his family's eyes, the ones he saw in the mirror every morning. When he finally managed to move, the sun was already setting. Blake felt dazed, like he had been struck on the head. He walked back the way he'd come, his thoughts in such a turmoil that he barely registered where his feet were leading him. He passed by a bar and almost went in. One drink or many seemed like the perfect answer at that moment. But then the image of Isla popped into his mind, counting her oranges so carefully, saving the money for her mother's surgery. Claire's surgery. No, he didn't deserve the temporary oblivion alcohol could give. He kept walking. By the time he stopped, he was standing in front of his building on Park Avenue, a brutal contrast to the building he'd been watching just hours before. The doorman greeted him respectfully, but Blake hardly noticed, heading straight for the private elevator that would take him to the penthouse. In his luxurious apartment, with panoramic views of Central Park, Blake went straight to the bar and poured himself a whiskey. He downed it in one gulp, welcoming the burning sensation in his throat, a pain more bearable than what he felt in his chest. Claire, he murmured into the empty apartment, what have I done to you? He poured himself another drink but didn't drink it. He just held the glass, staring at the amber liquid as though it contained the answers he so desperately needed. A million questions swirled in his mind. Why had Claire never told him about the pregnancy? Why had she vanished without a trace? How had she ended up in such a desperate situation? And Isla, sweet, brave Isla, could she truly be his daughter? Blake set the glass down, suddenly disgusted with himself. What right did he have to feel anything now? He had chosen his career, his ambition, his empire. Claire had been collateral damage in his relentless climb to the top. With heavy steps, he walked to his study and sat at the mahogany desk that had cost more than many people earned in a year. He opened a drawer and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside lay an engagement ring that had never been given. A solitary tear slid down his cheek as he stared at the jewel, which symbolized promises never made, a future he had sacrificed on the altar of his ambition. In that moment, alone in his palace of solitude, Blake Hamilton made a silent vow. Tomorrow, he would go back. Tomorrow, he would find the courage to face the ghosts of his past and perhaps redeem himself for 7 years of absence. But for now, the guilt was too heavy to carry. For now, he needed to gather the shattered pieces of his soul, broken by the sight of that bright-eyed little girl and her ailing mother. What he didn't yet know was that this chance encounter had changed his life forever, that nothing would ever be the same, that the man who woke up the next morning would not be the same one who walked the streets of the Lower East Side that day. Blake Hamilton, the lonely billionaire, had finally found something his money could never buy, the chance to fix the greatest mistake of his life. Blake didn't sleep that night. His attempts were cut short by nightmares in which a green-eyed girl accused him of abandoning her, while Claire lay dying in a hospital bed. By 4 in the morning, he gave up. He got up, went to the window, and stared at the city that never sleeps, a view he once found comforting, but which now seemed to mock his solitary wealth. The phone rang at 6, as always. It was Janet, his assistant of over a decade, reminding him of the meeting with Japanese investors scheduled for 9. "Cancel it," he said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Excuse me?" Janet rarely heard him cancel anything, especially a meeting of that caliber. "Cancel everything, today and tomorrow." "Blake, these investors came from the other side of the world. Tell them I'm sick, a family emergency, whatever it takes." There was silence on the other end of the line. Janet knew him too well. "Is everything all right?" she finally asked, genuine concern in her voice, something few people in his life ever showed him. "No," he admitted, "but maybe it will be soon." He hung up before she could ask more questions. He felt strangely light after making that decision. For the first time in years, maybe decades, his professional commitments felt insignificant compared to what he had discovered. Blake took a quick shower and dressed differently from his usual style. No tailored suits or Italian leather shoes. He chose dark jeans, a simple shirt, and sneakers. He wanted to appear approachable, not intimidating. In the mirror, a tired face stared back at him, eyes revealing a sleepless night and deep worries. "You can do this," he told his reflection without much conviction. He left the apartment and, instead of calling his driver, hailed a cab. His first destination wasn't Claire's building but a grocery store on the way. While the driver chatted about the morning traffic and the forecast for rain, Blake tried to recall what foods a child like Isla might enjoy. It had been a long time since he was a child himself, and it felt like a memory from another life. The supermarket was almost empty at that hour. Blake grabbed a cart and started filling it with basics: rice, beans, pasta, sauces, meat, fresh vegetables, fruit. He stopped in the dairy aisle, remembering how Claire loved Greek yogurt with honey. Had her preferences changed? He grabbed several just in case. In the cereal aisle, he froze at the endless array of colorful options. Which one would Isla like best? He decided to take 3 different kinds, imagining her delight at having choices, something clearly uncommon in her life. He added chocolate, cookies, ice cream, all the things every child should have without considering them luxuries. When he got to the checkout counter, his cart was so full he could barely push it. The young cashier raised her eyebrows at the sheer volume of items. "Big party?" she asked with a polite smile. "Something like that," Blake replied. Leaving the store with heavy bags, Blake realized how impractical his plan was. How would he carry all of this up to the apartment? He asked the waiting cab driver to help load the groceries, offering a generous tip. On the way to the Lower East Side, Blake felt his nervousness growing. What would he say to Claire? How would he explain his sudden reappearance? What if she shut the door in his face? Worse, what if she confirmed that Isla was indeed his daughter? Or if she denied it? The cab stopped a block from the building at Blake's request. He paid the fare, including a tip so large it made the driver's eyes widen, and refused the offer of help with the bags. He wanted to do this alone. The weight of the groceries was almost welcome, giving him a physical task to focus on besides his rising anxiety. He reached the red brick building out of breath, not just from the effort, but from the tension. The front door, as Isla had described, was partially broken, held in place by a chain. Blake pushed it with his shoulder and entered. The lobby was dimly lit and smelled musty. A pile of unclaimed mail lay in a corner. Paint was peeling from the walls, revealing layers of previous colors like an archaeological record of the building's decay. There was no elevator, just a narrow staircase spiraling upward. Blake started climbing, the bags feeling heavier with each step. As he went up, he pictured Claire making the same climb every day, perhaps carrying Isla when she was little, or lugging groceries while ill. The third floor had a hallway with 4 doors. Blake hesitated, realizing he had no idea which apartment was Claire's. He looked at each door, trying to guess. One was decorated with colorful animal stickers at a child's height. It had to be that one. He moved closer and listened. Silence. He took a deep breath and knocked. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then he heard soft footsteps approach, and a childish voice asked, "Who is it?" Blake's heart raced at the sound of Isla's voice. "It's Blake," he replied. "We met yesterday. I brought some things for you and your mom." There was a pause. Then the sound of a chain being slid back and a key turning. The door opened a crack, limited by another security chain. Isla's face appeared in the gap, her green eyes widening when she saw Blake. "Mr. Blake," she exclaimed with genuine excitement. "What are you doing here?" "Like I promised, I brought some things," he said, lifting the bags for her to see. "Can I come in?" Isla bit her lower lip, the same gesture he had noticed the day before. "I have to ask Mom," she said, closing the door again. Blake heard muffled voices on the other side, one high and excited, clearly Isla's, and another lower, hesitant, a voice he would recognize anywhere, even after 7 years. The door opened wider this time, but it wasn't Isla who appeared. Claire looked thinner than he remembered, dark circles under her eyes. Her hair, once long and shiny, was now short and dull. But her eyes, the same green eyes that were now her daughter's, were as expressive as ever. And at that moment, they expressed shock, disbelief, and something that looked like anger. "Blake," she said, her tone flat, hiding any emotion. "Claire," he answered, his voice almost a whisper. What are you doing here?" she interrupted, stepping protectively in front of Ilasu, who tried to peek around her. Blake raised the bags again. "I brought some groceries," he said. "Food mostly. I thought it might help." Claire's eyes narrowed. "How did you find us?" "I met Isla yesterday, selling oranges. She showed me your picture." Claire closed her eyes briefly, as though processing the information. When she opened them again, there was a determination Blake knew all too well. "Isla, go to your room, please," she said, not taking her eyes off Blake. "But Mom," the girl protested, "Mr. Blake brought food. And he was nice to me yesterday." "Isla," Claire repeated, her tone leaving no room for debate. "Now." The child lowered her head and walked away, dragging her feet. Once Isla was out of sight, Claire took a step forward, still blocking the entrance. "What do you really want, Blake?" she asked, her voice now loaded with contained emotion. "You show up after 7 years with some groceries and think everything is okay." "No," he replied, feeling small under the intensity of her gaze. "I know nothing is okay. I know I made terrible mistakes. I just want to help now." Claire let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Help? Now? Where was your help when I found out I was pregnant and you ran off to Shanghai without even leaving a contact number?" Her words hit Blake like a physical blow. So it was true. Isla was his daughter. Part of him had known since the moment he saw those green eyes so much like his own. But hearing the confirmation from Claire's lips brought an overwhelming sense of reality. "I didn't know," he said, his voice pleading to be believed. "Claire, I swear on everything that matters, I had no idea you were pregnant." She studied him for a long moment, as if deciding whether to believe him. "Would it have made a difference?" she asked finally. "Your precious career, your climb to the top, would you have given it all up for a pregnant girlfriend and a child you didn't plan?" Blake wanted to say yes, that he would have dropped everything, that he would have done things differently, but he couldn't. He couldn't lie to her now. "I don't know," he admitted, the truth hurting his throat. "I don't know who I was 7 years ago, but I know who I am now and I want to do the right thing." Claire observed him for a few more seconds, then opened the door completely. "You can leave the groceries," she said. "Thanks for that. Isla needs to eat well." Blake placed the bags on the small entryway floor. The apartment he could glimpse behind Claire was tiny but spotlessly clean, despite worn-out furniture and stained walls. "Can I see Isla?" he asked, his voice betraying his emotions. Just for a moment. Claire crossed her arms. Why? So you can disappear from her life again? I won't disappear, Blake promised. Never again. Words, she said wearily. You were always good with those. A coughing fit interrupted her. Claire covered her mouth with her hand, her frail body shaking with the effort. Blake took a step forward, instinctively wanting to help, but she raised her hand to stop him. I'm fine, she said once the coughing subsided, though her pallor suggested otherwise. You're not, Blake insisted. Isla told me about your condition, about the surgery you need. Claire's face hardened. I don't need your charity. It's not charity, he insisted. It's responsibility. She's my daughter, Claire. I have both a right and an obligation to help. A right? Her voice rose dangerously. What right do you have over a child you've never met, never saw growing up? You didn't hold her when she had a fever, or comfort her when she had nightmares. You weren't there for any birthdays, any Christmases, any important moments in her life. Every word was a stab in Blake's chest. The worst part was that she was absolutely right. None, he admitted, his voice almost inaudible. I have no rights. But Isla has every right to a better life than this. She has the right to a healthy mother, and you... He hesitated, aware he was treading on dangerous ground. You have the right to proper medical care. Claire leaned against the doorframe, suddenly appearing exhausted. The brief burst of anger had consumed what little energy she had. It's too late, Blake, she said, her voice now more sad than angry. Too late for many things. A lump formed in his throat. Too late for the treatment. Maybe for that too, she answered vaguely. But I was talking about us, about trusting you again. I'm not asking you to trust me, Blake said, just to let me help. For Isla. Hearing her daughter's name seemed to affect Claire. Her expression softened slightly. Mom? Isla's voice drifted from the hallway behind her. Can I come out now? I want to see what Mr. Blake brought. Claire closed her eyes for a moment, as though mustering strength. When she opened them, there was a resigned look in them. Yes, honey. You can come. Isla appeared at her mother's side almost instantly, as if she'd been waiting right there in the hallway. Her eyes lit up upon seeing the bags. Wow, is all that for us? Blake couldn't hold back a smile at her excitement. Yes, it's all for you. Isla immediately began rummaging through the bags, exclaiming joyfully at the colorful cereals and the ice cream, which she quickly took to put in the freezer before it melted. Claire watched with a complex expression, a mixture of reluctant gratitude and lingering mistrust. When Isla disappeared into the tiny kitchen with the ice cream, Claire turned to Blake. I don't want her getting attached to you, she said quietly. Not if you're going to vanish at the first opportunity. She has enough problems without adding a father who just showed up. The words hurt, but Blake knew she was right. I won't vanish, he repeated, looking her directly in the eyes. I know I can't prove that now. I can only ask that you let me demonstrate it with actions, not words. Claire didn't respond immediately. Isla returned, holding an open tub of ice cream with a spoon sticking out. Want some, Mr. Blake? She offered, extending the spoon toward him. It was such an innocent, generous gesture, this child who had almost nothing offering to share her first treat, that Blake felt tears prick his eyes. He cleared his throat and shook his head softly. Thank you, Isla, but it's all yours, he replied, his voice strained with emotion. How about you, Mom? Isla asked, offering the spoon to Claire. A tired smile briefly lit Claire's face. Just a little bit. She leaned forward and tasted the ice cream her daughter offered. For a fleeting moment, her expression brightened, and Blake could see a hint of the Claire he'd once known, young, full of life and dreams. It's delicious, she told her daughter, who beamed with satisfaction. Blake felt like an intruder, witnessing a private moment between mother and child. It was a harsh reminder of all the similar moments he had missed. I'll leave you two now, he said softly, but I'd like to come back tomorrow, if that's okay. Claire looked up at him, distrust still evident in her eyes, but now tinged with something like resignation. I can't stop you, she replied, but don't make any promises to Isla you don't intend to keep. Blake nodded, accepting her condition. He glanced at Isla, who was watching the adults interact with curiosity. "See you later, Isla," he said. "I hope I can come back and see you tomorrow." "Will you bring more ice cream?" she asked hopefully. Blake smiled. "If your mom allows it." Claire said nothing, but her look spoke volumes. "Don't let her down." Blake stepped back into the hallway, his chest heavy with conflicting emotions. On the one hand, a sharp pain at realizing what he had lost, 7 years of his daughter's life. On the other, a fragile hope for a new beginning. "I'll find the best doctors for you," he said to Claire before leaving. "That's not negotiable." For a moment, it seemed she was about to protest again, but then another coughing fit struck her, this time stronger than the previous one. Isla immediately set aside the ice cream and ran to hold her mother's hand, fear evident on her small face. The sight broke Blake's heart. It was obvious the situation was more serious than Claire admitted. When the coughing subsided, she simply nodded, a barely perceptible gesture of acceptance. Blake left the building feeling both lighter and heavier at the same time. The truth was now laid bare, raw and painful. Isla was his daughter. Claire was truly ill, and he had 7 years of absence to make up for, if that was even possible. As he walked down the busy street, he mentally went over his next steps, calls to his medical contacts, arranging immediate treatment for Claire, consultations with lawyers about his rights and responsibilities as a father. Part of him, the cold, calculating side that had built his empire, advised caution, paternity tests, verification of Claire's true medical condition, protection against possible excessive financial demands. But for the first time in his adult life, Blake Hamilton silenced that voice. It didn't matter whether Isla was biologically his, though he was certain she was. It didn't matter how much Claire's treatment would cost. It didn't matter about legal hassles or complications. The only thing that mattered was that broken family he had, intentionally or not, helped destroy. And now he had a chance, perhaps his last chance, to fix it. When he finally hailed a cab to take him home, Blake realized he was smiling. It was a sad smile, marked by regret, but a smile nonetheless. For the first time in many years, he felt like he was doing something truly meaningful. Nightfall was settling over New York when Blake returned to his apartment. He poured himself a drink and went out onto the balcony, watching the city light up below. Somewhere in that sea of lights, a green-eyed little girl might be thinking about him. Tomorrow would be a new day. Tomorrow he would start building bridges over the 7-year chasm. Tomorrow he would face Claire's resistance and try to earn Isla's affection. But tonight was for decisions, and Blake Hamilton had decided no more running away. No more choosing ambition over love. No more abandoning those who needed him. This evening, high above his lonely empire, he made a silent vow to the stars. He would be the father Isla deserved and the man Claire needed him to be. Even if it was too late for some things, as Claire had said, he would do everything in his power to make sure it wasn't too late for those that truly mattered. Blake didn't sleep again that night. His attempts were interrupted by thoughts of Claire and Isla, of lost time, of Claire's health condition that she tried to hide, but which was obvious in every tired movement, every labored breath. At 5 in the morning, he gave up trying. He went to his study, turned on his computer, and began researching the best hospitals in the city, specialists for every possible condition Claire might have. Without knowing her exact diagnosis, he prepared for every possibility. He made a few calls, even at that hour, to people who wouldn't mind being woken up by Blake Hamilton. His name opened doors, something he had always known but had rarely used for anything beyond business. Now that power would serve a different purpose. By 8 in the morning, he had a list of doctors ready to see Claire immediately, hospitals prepared to admit her to private rooms, specialists standing by for his call. All he needed now was to persuade her to accept his help. Blake took a quick shower, dressed as simply as the day before, and went out. On the way, he stopped at a bakery and bought fresh breakfast items, bread, pastries, fruit. He remembered how Claire used to love croissants with raspberry jam and made sure to include them. The sky was overcast, threatening rain. Blake quickened his pace, feeling an inexplicable urgency, as if every minute was precious. He arrived at the red brick building a little after 9, quickly climbing the 3 flights of stairs. That was when he heard it. the sound of a child crying, a desperate cry coming from Claire's apartment. It wasn't the cry of a child upset or in minor pain. It was the sound of pure fear, of utter despair. Blake felt ice in his veins. He dropped the bags in the hallway and ran to the door, pounding on it. "Isla! Claire!" he shouted, panic rising in his voice. The crying continued, broken by sobs. Then, hurried footsteps approached, and Isla's trembling voice asked who was there. "It's Blake." "What happened? Are you all right?" The door opened immediately. Isla stood there in her pajamas, her face red and swollen from crying, hair tousled. Her green eyes were wide with terror. "Mr. Blake," she sobbed. "My mum won't wake up. I tried everything, but she won't answer." Blake didn't wait for more explanations. He stepped inside, following Isla to the small bedroom where Claire slept. The room was simple, with only a bed, a nightstand, and an old dresser. Water stains marked the walls, but they were adorned with colorful drawings, obviously Isla's work. Claire lay on the bed, pale as paper. Her breathing was so shallow that, for one terrifying moment, Blake thought he was too late. He rushed over, sitting on the edge of the bed and checking her pulse. It was there, weak and irregular, but present. "Claire," he called, gently patting her cheek. "Claire, wake up." She didn't respond. Isla clung to Blake's waist, shaking. "She was coughing so much last night," the girl explained, words broken by sobs. "Then this morning she didn't get up to take me to school. I thought she was just tired, but when I came to check, she wouldn't respond." Blake put an arm around Isla's shoulders, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, already taking his phone out of his pocket. "I don't know," Isla replied, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "I think it's been about an hour since I started trying to wake her up." Blake dialed one of the contacts he'd prepared earlier. When they answered, his voice took on an authoritative tone Isla had never heard before. "Dr. Ramirez, this is Blake Hamilton. I need an ambulance to the Lower East Side immediately. It's an emergency." He gave the address and hung up, turning to Isla. "I'm taking your mom to the hospital right now. I need you to be strong and help me, okay?" Isla nodded, still teary-eyed but filled with a childlike trust that made Blake's heart ache. She trusted him instantly. No questions asked, just like only a child can. "What do I do?" she asked, straightening her small shoulders as if bracing for an important mission. "Grab some clothes for you and your mom, just enough for a few days. Toothbrushes, a comb, anything important. Can you do that?" Isla nodded again and ran off to fulfill the task. Blake turned back to Claire. She burned with fever, her forehead hot under his hand. Her fingers, by contrast, were icy cold. He felt fear surging, mixed with a corrosive guilt. What if it was too late? What if all those years of neglect had cost Claire her life? "No," he muttered to himself. "That's not going to happen." He pulled out his phone again and dialed another contact. "Janet, get in touch with New York Presbyterian Hospital. Tell Dr. Sullivan I'm on my way with a critical patient. I want the best team ready to receive her." When he hung up, Isla was back, holding a small worn backpack. "I put our things in here," she said, showing him the bag. "And Mom's medicine, too." "Great job," Blake praised her, trying to smile reassuringly. "Now I'm going to carry your mum downstairs. An ambulance is coming, but we can't wait." Without hesitation, Blake wrapped Claire in a blanket and lifted her into his arms. She felt alarmingly light, as if the illness had consumed not just her strength but her very substance. Her head fell against his chest, and a faint moan escaped her chapped lips. "Come on, Isla. Stay close to me." Together, they made their way down the stairs, Blake careful not to jostle Claire unnecessarily. Isla followed, a small hand gripping his shirt, as if afraid he might disappear too. When they reached the street, Blake spotted a taxi passing by and flagged it urgently. The driver stopped, looking suspiciously at the unconscious woman in Blake's arms. "New York Presbyterian Hospital, as fast as possible," he ordered, already opening the back door and gently placing Claire on the seat. "It's an emergency." Something in his tone or the urgency of the situation convinced the driver, who nodded and unlocked the doors. Blake helped Isla in and climbed in himself, keeping Claire cradled in his arms. "If you get us there in under 15 minutes, God, I'll triple your fare," he added. That was all it took. The taxi sped off, diving into morning traffic with renewed determination. During the ride, Blake kept his fingers on Claire's pulse, counting the faint beats as if he could keep her alive by sheer force of will. Isla sat quietly beside him, eyes fixed on her mother's face, clutching her backpack tight. "She's going to get better, right?" she asked at one point, her voice so soft Blake almost didn't hear. He wanted to say yes, that everything would be okay, that her mom would pull through just like she always did. But he couldn't lie to those green eyes so much like his own. "I'll do everything I can to make sure of that," he finally replied, knowing it was the only honest promise he could make. Isla seemed to accept this answer, nodding gravely. Blake realized, with a mixture of admiration and sadness, that this child had grown up far too quickly, forced to grasp realities no child should face. The taxi screeched to a halt outside the hospital's emergency entrance. As promised, a medical team was already waiting outside. 2 nurses with a gurney, a doctor in a white coat, and Janet, Blake's assistant, who had arrived beforehand to ensure everything was in place. Blake stepped out of the taxi, carrying Claire, refusing the gurney for the moment. "Doctor Sullivan?" he asked, addressing the doctor. "Yes," the man replied, already assessing the patient visually. "We'll take her in for evaluation right away." Blake finally placed Claire on the gurney but didn't let go of her hand. Isla jumped out of the taxi and ran to the other side of the gurney, grabbing her mother's other hand. As the medical team began pushing the gurney inside the hospital, Dr. Sullivan bombarded Blake with questions about Claire's medical history, her symptoms, how long she'd been unconscious. Blake answered what he could, painfully aware of how little he actually knew about the woman who had once been closest to him. Surprisingly, Isla filled in many of the gaps. "She takes these," she said, pulling a small case out of her backpack and handing it to the doctor. 3 times a day. And she uses this inhaler when she can't breathe." Dr. Sullivan examined the medications quickly, his expression growing serious. "Does your mum have any heart or lung problems that you know of, sweetie?" he asked gently. Isla nodded. "Both. She says her heart gets weak sometimes, and her lungs fill up with water. That's why she coughs so much." Blake felt the floor drop out from under him. Heart failure and pulmonary edema, serious conditions that could be fatal without proper treatment. "How long has she had these symptoms?" the doctor asked, now mostly directing his questions to Isla as they entered an exam room. "Always," the little girl answered simply, "as long as I can remember." Years, then. Claire had been sick for years, without proper treatment, fighting on her own while raising a child Blake hadn't even known existed. The guilt hit him like an avalanche. While he was amassing billions and building his global empire, the woman he had loved was wasting away, saving every penny to care for the daughter he didn't know about. A nurse approached, kindly asking them to wait outside while the team performed initial procedures. Blake hesitated, reluctant to leave Claire, but he knew the doctors needed space to work. "Let's go, Isla," he said, extending a hand to the girl. "We'll wait out there. The doctors will take good care of your mum." Isla took one last look at Claire, then clung to Blake's hand, letting him guide her to the waiting area. Janet followed discreetly, handling everything behind the scenes as she always did. They sat on cushioned chairs in a private waiting area, separated from the general public by tasteful partitions. Janet brought water and juice, also offering snacks that Isla declined with a shake of her head. "I'm not hungry," she explained. "My stomach feels funny." Blake nodded, understanding perfectly. His own stomach was in knots, filled with anxiety and fear. "Mr. Blake?" Isla broke the silence after a few minutes. "Is my mom going to die?" The question, asked with brutal childish honesty, punched the air out of Blake. He turned to face her, seeing the genuine fear in her eyes, his eyes, and wanting desperately to shield her from all pain. "Not if I can help it," he said with fierce determination that surprised even him. "This hospital has some of the best doctors in the world, and they'll do everything they can to help your mom." Isla studied his face for a moment, as if searching for any hint of deception or hesitation. Then, to Blake's surprise, she moved closer and rested her head against his arm. "Thank you for helping us," she said softly. "I prayed for someone to come." Blake felt a lump in his throat and, on impulse, placed his arm around her shoulders, drawing her closer. "I'm here now," he promised, "and I'm not going anywhere." They remained like that, in silence, for almost an hour. Eventually, Isla accepted some orange juice and a sandwich Janet offered, eating slowly, without much enthusiasm. Blake kept his eyes on the doors Claire had passed through, as if sheer will could produce news. Janet sat on the other side, discreetly fielding the endless calls and messages coming to Blake's phone, shielding him from the outside world that kept spinning, unaware of the drama unfolding there. Finally, Dr. Sullivan emerged, still in his white coat and holding a clipboard. His face was serious, but not grim, a slight relief to Blake, who had learned to interpret medical expressions over the years. Blake stood immediately, Isla following suit, clinging tightly to his hand with surprising strength for someone so small. "Mr. Hamilton," the doctor began, "we've managed to stabilize your Ms. Bennett." Blake exhaled the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. What exactly is wrong with her? Dr. Sullivan glanced at Isla, then back at Blake, clearly unsure how much detail to reveal in front of a child. Blake hesitated, not wanting to frighten her, but also knowing Isla deserved to know what was happening to her mother. "Isla," he said, crouching to meet her gaze, "I need to talk to the doctor about your mom's condition. Can you wait with Janet for a few minutes? I promise I'll explain everything afterward, in a way you can understand." The girl bit her lip, looking from the doctor to Blake, then to Janet, who smiled encouragingly. "Okay," she finally agreed. "But don't take too long." "I promise," Blake said, giving her hand a gentle squeeze before letting go. Janet guided Isla toward a small play area in the corner of the waiting room, far enough that she couldn't hear the conversation, but still within Blake's sight. He turned back to the doctor, bracing himself for the worst. "How serious is it?" he asked directly. "Doctor." Sullivan didn't hesitate. "Serious, but not hopeless. Miss Bennett has dilated cardiomyopathy with resulting congestive heart failure. She also has significant pulmonary edema and signs of bacterial pneumonia, which appears to be the immediate trigger for her current decompensation." Blake absorbed the information, his mind automatically sorting through options the way it did in business. Prognosis. With immediate and aggressive treatment, the chances are good. We've already started broad-spectrum antibiotics for the pneumonia, along with medication to improve her heart function. The pulmonary edema is responding to diuretics. And long-term. The doctor hesitated slightly. Cardiomyopathy is a chronic condition. From what I can tell from the preliminary tests, her heart has suffered significant damage, likely from going untreated for so long. Will she need a transplant? Blake went straight to the point. It's too early to say for sure, but it can't be ruled out. For now, we need to focus on stabilizing her and treating the pneumonia. I recommend a series of more detailed tests once she's strong enough to handle them. Blake nodded, already making mental decisions. Do whatever it takes, Dr. Sullivan. Cost is not an issue. I want the best team, the best specialists, the best treatments available. If there's any experimental option that might help, I want to know about it. Understood, Mr. Hamilton. I've already alerted our cardiology team. Dr. Patel, the department head Jan, is on his way. When can I see her? Soon. We're moving her to the ICU for at least 24 hours of close monitoring. After she's settled, we'll allow brief visits. Blake thanked the doctor, who promised to return with updates. Alone for a moment, Blake allowed himself to feel the full weight of the situation. Claire could have died today. Probably would have, if he hadn't shown up. The thought was unbearable. He took several deep breaths, composing himself before going back to Isla. She was watching him intently from across the room, ignoring the tablet of games Janet had offered. When Blake approached, Isla immediately stood. "How's Mom?" she asked, her wide green eyes scared but determined to know the truth. Blake sat beside her, choosing his words carefully, aiming for a 6-year-old's level of understanding. "Your mom is really sick, Isla," he began gently. "Her heart isn't working as well as it should, and her lungs are affected too. Plus, she got an infection, kind of like a very bad flu that made everything worse. Isla nodded gravely. I knew she was getting worse. She tried to hide it, but I could tell. The child's perceptiveness was both admirable and heartbreaking. The doctors are taking care of her now, Blake continued. They gave her medicine to fight the infection and help her heart work better. She'll have to stay in the hospital for a few days, maybe more. Can I see her? Isla asked, her voice small but hopeful. Soon, as soon as the doctors have her settled in a special room. For now, we have to be patient. Isla was quiet for a moment, processing the information. Then, to Blake's surprise, she leaned in and hugged him, pressing her face against his chest. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice muffled by his shirt. Blake wrapped his arms around her, feeling a fierce protectiveness he had never experienced before. In that moment, he knew he would do anything, absolutely anything, to protect this child. I know, he answered softly. I'm scared too, but we're in this together now, you and me. We'll take care of your mom together. Isla lifted her head, those green eyes, Blake's eyes, brimming with tears yet filled with fragile hope. Promise, she asked. I promise, Blake replied, sealing a commitment he knew would change his life forever. 3 days had passed since Claire's admission to the hospital. The pneumonia was starting to respond to the antibiotics, but her heart condition still required intense monitoring. The doctors mentioned weeks of hospitalization and possibly surgery to implant a ventricular assist device. During this time, Blake completely reorganized his life. He cancelled business trips, delegated responsibilities, and set up a makeshift office in the hospital suite he had arranged for Claire. But the most surprising development, for everyone, including himself, was how naturally he assumed care for Isla. On the first night, when it became clear Claire wouldn't be discharged anytime soon, Blake faced a dilemma: what to do about Isla. The child had no other relatives, and the one neighbor who sometimes watched her, Mrs. Rodriguez, was traveling. You can stay with me while your mum gets better, he offered, hesitant, fearing she might reject him. I have a guest room that can be yours for now. Isla looked at her mother asleep in the hospital bed, then back at Blake. Her green eyes seemed to be weighing all the possibilities. Mom would want me to be with someone safe, she finally said, with a maturity that continued to surprise him. Can I bring my teddy bear, Theodore? Blake felt a surge of relief. Of course you can. And anything else you want. That same night, after a quick visit to her apartment to pick up Isla's things, including Theodore, a scruffy brown bear that seemed to be her closest companion, they headed to Blake's Park Avenue apartment. Isla's eyes widened as they walked through the marble lobby with its high ceiling and crystal chandeliers. Do you live in a castle? She asked in a hushed voice, clinging to Blake's hand while she took in the surroundings. Blake smiled. It's not a castle, just an old building where rich people live. Are you rich? The child's direct question, typical of a 6-year-old, took Blake by surprise. Yes, he admitted. I have a lot of money. Isla nodded, absorbing the information. Then why don't Mom and I have any? The innocent question hit Blake like a physical blow. How could he explain to a 6-year-old the complicated failings of adults, the choices that lead to separate paths, the wounded pride, the broken communication? It's complicated, he finally managed. But I promise I'll explain better when you're a bit older. To his surprise, Isla seemed satisfied, just nodding again. Inside the apartment, he showed her the guest room, which Janet had quickly furnished with a few basic kids' items, a colorful lamp, storybooks, and some simple toys. This can be your room while you're here, he said. Tomorrow we can buy more things you like. Isla explored the space curiously, placing Theodore carefully on the king-size bed that looked absurdly big for her little body. It's nice, she commented, but it doesn't feel real. Blake understood exactly what she meant. The room, with its elegant but impersonal decor, lacked warmth and history, the marks of a lived-in home. It wasn't like the tiny, cramped apartment she shared with Claire, which was full of love despite its poverty. That first night was strange for both of them. Blake prepared a simple dinner, macaroni and cheese, one of the few things he knew how to cook, and tried to keep a natural conversation going with Isla. The child answered politely, but there was a distance in her demeanor, a worry overshadowing her thoughts. At bedtime, he helped her brush her teeth and change clothes, feeling entirely awkward and unprepared for the task. "Your mom will get better," he said as he tucked her in, trying to offer some comfort. Isla nodded, hugging Theodore. "She's strong," she answered simply. "Good night, Mr. Blake." "You can just call me Blake if you want," he offered. She thought about it for a moment. "Okay, good night, Blake." The days that followed involved a series of small adjustments. Blake, used to running multinational corporations, discovered that managing a 6-year-old's routine was just as challenging. There were schedules to keep, meals to prepare, baths to supervise. He hired a personal assistant specifically to help with Isla, but Blake insisted on being as hands-on as possible. For her part, Isla watched everything with curious eyes, silently adapting to her new environment. She was surprisingly easygoing, maybe because she had grown up taking on responsibilities beyond her years, or maybe because she instinctively understood how serious her mother's situation was. Every day, they visited Claire in the hospital. The visits were short, as she spent most of the time asleep, often under the influence of medication that left her groggy. But those brief moments were the highlight of Isla's day. The child would chat to her mother about everything she'd done, showing drawings and small gifts she'd made. During one such visit, Blake watched from a corner as Isla whispered something into her unconscious mother's ear. The intimacy of that moment, the absolute trust that even in her sleep, Claire was listening, stirred something deep inside him. He realized then he would do anything to protect that bond. On the third day, things began to change between them. A routine had formed. In the morning, they went to see Claire, who was awake for slightly longer periods each day, though still very weak. In the afternoon, while Blake worked remotely, Isla occupied herself with the new toys and books he'd bought. In the evening, they'd have a simple dinner and talk about the day. It was during one of these dinners that the first real breakthrough occurred. "Blake," Isla said, pushing the macaroni around on her plate, "can I ask you something?" "Sure," he replied, setting his fork down to show she had his full attention. "How did you meet my mom?" The question caught Blake off guard, causing him to choke on the wine he was sipping. When he recovered, he saw Isla watching him with a mix of curiosity and patience, waiting for his answer. For a brief moment, he considered making something up, a simpler or edited version of the truth, but something in her gaze, so much like his own, demanded honesty. "Your mom and I met a long time ago," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I had just started my company, and she worked at a coffee shop near my first office." Isla listened intently, absorbing every word. "Every day, I went there for coffee, and every day she gave me this special smile only she could give," Blake continued, feeling a pang of nostalgia and sorrow. "One day, after almost a month, I finally got the courage to ask her out." "Did she say yes?" Isla asked, leaning forward, completely engrossed in the story. "Not the first time," Blake said, smiling at the memory. "She said she was too busy, so I asked again the next day and the next. By the fourth day, she finally said yes, just so I'd stop asking." Isla giggled, a crystal-clear sound that lit up the usually quiet apartment with unexpected joy. "We dated for almost 2 years," Blake went on, now entering more difficult territory. "They were the best years of my life. Your mom is special. She has a way of making any place feel like home." "I know," Isla said, nodding knowingly. "She makes the best hot chocolate in the world, even when we don't have real chocolate." Blake felt a lump form in his throat. "That sounds exactly like her." "And then?" Isla pressed. "Why didn't you stay together?" Blake took a deep breath. This was the hardest part, but he knew he owed the truth to this child. "I made mistakes, Isla, big ones. My company started growing, and I let work become more important than anything, more important than your mum, more important than building a life together. I traveled constantly, and I was barely there when she needed me." Isla kept her gaze fixed on him without judgment, just trying to understand. "In the end, I got a business opportunity in China and accepted it without really discussing it with her. It was supposed to be 6 months but ended up being a year. When I came back, she was gone," Isla concluded. Blake nodded, amazed at her insight. "Yes, she was gone. I lost her because of the wrong choices I made. Silence hung between them as Isla processed the information. Then, to Blake's surprise, she reached out and gently touched his hand. "But now you're here," she said simply, "and you're helping Mom. And you're taking care of me." Blake felt tears burn at the corners of his eyes. "Yes," he managed to say, "I'm here now, and I want to do things differently this time, if your mom will let me. If you'll let me." Isla considered this with the seriousness of someone much older than 6. "I think you deserve a second chance," she finally declared. "Everyone does if they're really sorry." Something shifted between them in that moment. It wasn't a dramatic revelation or an instant transformation, but the beginning of trust, still fragile but real. A bridge beginning to form over the gulf of lost years, supported by honesty and Blake's genuine desire to do better. Later that night, when he tucked Isla into bed, she asked him to read her a story, and for the first time, she allowed him to sit at the edge of the bed instead of on the chair farther away. A small gesture, but it meant everything. "This was your mum's favorite story when we were younger," Blake said, showing her the book he'd chosen, a classic children's tale he remembered Claire mentioning once. Isla's eyes lit up at this unexpected connection to her mom. "Really? She never told me that." "There are lots of things you two still have to discover about each other," Blake said softly. "And plenty of stories we can create together from now on." As he read, he watched Isla's eyes grow heavy until she finally drifted off. Theodore clutched to her chest. Blake stayed there for a long time, gazing at the face of the daughter he was only just beginning to know, awed by how someone so small and fragile could hold such strength and wisdom. Day by day, small moments like that built a bond between them that Blake had never experienced before. A bond forged not from grand gestures or expensive gifts, but from steady presence, honesty, and the simple routines they shared. The quiet affection that grew, solid yet gentle, like a plant seeking sunlight after a long time in the dark. A week had passed since Claire's hospitalization. Her health showed encouraging signs of improvement, although the doctors remained cautious. The lung infection responded well to antibiotics, and the heart medication seemed to be stabilizing her condition, at least for the time being. For Blake and Isla, those days created a near-familial routine. Mornings began with breakfast together. Blake had learned to make fun-shaped pancakes that made Isla smile. Then they would visit Claire at the hospital, spending a few hours by her side. In the afternoons, while Blake worked in his makeshift office, Isla colored or read the new books he'd bought for her. Evenings brought simple dinners, followed by bedtime stories. Gradually, the awkward moments became fewer, and a genuine connection began to blossom. Isla no longer hesitated to ask for help when she needed it, and Blake no longer felt entirely lost in taking care of her daily needs. On this particular night, while waiting for a pizza delivery at Isla's request, they sat in the spacious living room overlooking Central Park. Isla was busy drawing, her tongue peeking out in concentration. Blake was on his laptop, occasionally glancing up to watch her. "What are you drawing?" he finally asked, curious about her intense focus. Isla held up the paper to show a simple yet expressive sketch of 3 stick figures. One large, one medium, and one small, all holding hands. "It's us," she explained. "Me as Mom and you." Something twisted in Blake's chest, a feeling for which he had no name. It was both painful and comforting. "That's a beautiful drawing," he said, his voice slightly husky. "Can I keep it when you're done?" Isla nodded, resuming her work with renewed dedication. A few minutes later, she broke the silence with a question that seemed to come out of nowhere. "Blake, do you think my dad is dead?" The question hit him like a punch to the stomach. He closed his laptop slowly, buying time to think. Isla was watching him with those inquisitive green eyes, his eyes awaiting his response. "Why do you ask that?" he managed finally. Isla shrugged, but there was tension in her small shoulders that betrayed her casual tone. "Sometimes I think he must be, because if he wasn't, why would he never look for us? But other times," she paused, looking back at her drawing, "other times I think maybe he just didn't care enough." Blake felt as though something were being ripped out of his chest. The idea that his daughter had spent years imagining her father as dead or, worse, uncaring was almost unbearable. "What does your mum say about him?" he asked cautiously, aware that he was treading on extremely delicate ground. Isla lifted her eyes again, and the simplicity of her answer was more devastating than any elaboration. "Mom never talked about my dad. I never knew who he was." Blake felt the impact of those words like a cold wave crashing over him. Claire had never mentioned his existence to Isla, not even to create a story about him. She had completely erased him from their narrative, as though he had never existed. It was an absence so complete and deliberate that Blake finally understood the depth of Claire's hurt. She'd rather raise her daughter without any father figure than share any memory of him. "Have you ever asked her?" he inquired softly. Isla bit her lower lip. That gesture he now recognized as his own, reflected in his daughter. "I asked once, when I was 5. My friends at school were talking about their dads, and I wanted to know about mine." She paused, recalling, "Mom got really sad. Really sad. She cried all night. I never asked again." Blake closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the pain of that memory spread through him. Claire crying alone at night, a confused and frightened Isla, both outcomes of his choices, his absence. "Do you think he was a bad person?" Isla asked, her small voice cutting through his thoughts. Blake opened his eyes to find her watching him intently, as if his words might unlock the mystery that had surrounded her entire short life. "No," he replied carefully. "I think sometimes people make mistakes, really big ones, that end up hurting the people they love, even if they don't mean to." "Like the mistakes you made with my mom?" Isla asked, her penetrating gaze making Blake feel completely transparent. "Yes," he admitted. "Like those..." Isla seemed to ponder that deeply before she spoke again. "You know, sometimes I make up stories about him," she confessed softly. "In my head. Sometimes he's an astronaut who had to go into space on a really important mission, or an explorer lost in the jungle, or..." She hesitated, her voice suddenly shy. "Or someone like you." Blake felt his heart almost stop. "Like me?" Isla nodded, blushing. "Someone nice and who tells stories and makes funny pancakes, who takes care of us when we need him." In that moment, Blake experienced both pain and joy in the most intense way. He wanted to scoop her into a hug, to shout the truth, to declare everything. But he couldn't. It wasn't his secret to tell, not without Claire. It wouldn't be fair to either of them. Instead, he gently tucked a rebellious curl behind Isla's ear, a gesture he had seen Claire do so many times during their hospital visits. "Any man would be lucky to be your father, Isla," he said quietly. "And if he knew about you, I'm sure he'd be the proudest person in the world." She rewarded him with a smile as bright as a ray of sunshine cutting through dense clouds. Their conversation shifted to lighter topics when the pizza arrived, but something deeper had changed between them. A stronger understanding, a more solid trust. Blake knew he had been tested in some way, and for now, he had passed. Later that night, after tucking Isla into bed, Blake sat in his office with an untouched glass of whiskey, reflecting on everything he had learned. Through subtle questions during the week, through conversations with Janet, who had dug into Claire's background, and now through Isla's revelations, Blake had pieced together a grim picture of the years that had passed. When Claire disappeared from his life, she had been in the early stages of pregnancy, probably not even aware of it at first. Once she did know, she chose to face it alone rather than look for him. She moved multiple times, took precarious jobs while her health slowly deteriorated. There were periods with no fixed address, nights spent in shelters, real hunger when money ran out before the month's end, a constant battle against a healthcare system that provided inadequate support. And throughout it all, there was Isla, a child growing up in conditions no child should ever endure, yet somehow developing a resilience, intelligence and kindness that defied her circumstances. Blake raised his glass, watching the lamp's light refract in the amber liquid. His fortune, his empire, all seemed suddenly empty compared to what he could have had, to what he could have given them. That night, alone in his luxurious office, he made a silent vow that went beyond his previous promises. His mission wasn't just to fix the past, though that was still crucial. It was to build a future. A future where Isla would no longer have to invent stories about an absent father. A future where Claire wouldn't have to carry her burdens alone until she collapsed. A future where they could be the family they were meant to be all along. While Claire slept in her hospital bed, slowly regaining her strength, and Isla dreamed in the next room, Blake finally understood his true purpose. It wasn't to create wealth, build companies, or accumulate power. It was to love and protect these two people who, even in his absence, had shaped him completely. And he promised himself, with every ounce of determination he possessed, that as long as he lived, they would never again know hunger, homelessness, or abandonment. They would never fight alone. They would never fear tomorrow. That promise, made in the silent hours of the night, sealed a transformation that began the moment he first saw Isla's green eyes selling oranges on a random street corner in New York. The hospital room was quiet that morning, save for the steady beeping of the machines monitoring Claire's vital signs. Blake sat in the chair beside her bed, focused on his laptop while she slept. 2 weeks had passed since she'd been admitted, and the doctors were pleased with her progress. The pneumonia was fully under control, and her heart condition was stable, though long-term treatment options needed to be discussed. Isla was at school. Blake had found a private institution near the hospital that agreed to enroll her mid-semester. Initially hesitant, the girl adjusted surprisingly well, especially after Blake explained they could visit Claire every day after school. A subtle movement in the bed caught his attention. Claire shifted slightly, her fingers twitching on the white blanket. Blake shut his laptop and leaned forward, watching her carefully. Over the past few days, she had woken a few times, but only briefly, still groggy from medication. This time, however, when her eyes opened, there was a clarity in them that hadn't been there before. Claire blinked several times, adjusting to the soft light that filtered in through the half-open blinds. Her gaze swept the room until it landed on Blake. "Water," she croaked, her voice rough from disuse. Blake jumped up immediately, grabbing the cup and straw he kept ready on the bedside table. He helped her raise her head slightly and brought the straw to her lips. Claire took a few sips, then closed her eyes for a moment as though the simple act of drinking water was the most precious relief. "Thank you," she said when she finished, settling back onto the pillow. Blake returned the cup to the table and sat down, unsure what to say. Over the 2 weeks she'd been hospitalized, he'd envisioned this moment countless times. What he'd say, how he'd explain everything that happened, how he'd discuss Isla. But now, confronted by Claire's direct gaze, none of his rehearsed words felt right. "How long?" she asked, breaking the silence. 2 weeks, he answered. "You had acute pneumonia on top of your heart condition. It was scary." Claire nodded slightly, as though she had expected it. "Isla? She's fine. She's in school right now. She stayed with me while you were unconscious." A shadow of worry crossed Claire's face. "School? I enrolled her at Dalton, a few blocks from here. It's a good school. She's adapting well, all things considered," Blake explained, attempting to reassure her. "We've been visiting you every day." Claire was quiet for a few moments, processing. When she spoke again, her voice was stronger but laced with suppressed emotion. "Thank you, you saved my life, but old wounds still exist." The honesty in that statement cut deeply. There was no open accusation in her tone, but a clear acknowledgement that gratitude didn't erase the past. "I know," he replied, equally honest. "I don't expect you to forget or forgive easily. I just want to help, however I can." Claire studied him for a moment, her green eyes so much like Isla's, searching his face as though looking for something specific. "Why?" she finally asked. "After all this time? Why now?" Blake could have said many things, mentioned the chance encounter with Isla, or talked about seeking redemption or regret. But he chose the simplest truth. "Because I finally understand what really matters," he said. "And it's none of the things I spent years chasing." Claire didn't respond, but something in her gaze softened almost imperceptibly. She turned her head toward the window, watching the blue sky and drifting clouds. "Did the doctors say when I can go home?" she asked after a moment. Blake hesitated. "In a few more days, probably, but Claire..." "About your home, what about it?" I moved your and Isla's things into an apartment I rented near here, temporarily, he explained cautiously. I thought it would be more practical during your recovery, being close to the hospital and Isla's school. He braced for anger, righteous indignation that he'd taken such a major step without consulting her. But Claire just nodded faintly. Makes sense, she said. Thank you. Silence fell between them again, less tense this time, but still laden with words unspoken. Blake wanted to ask about the past, about the lost years, about Isla. He wanted to confess he knew that he had figured it out, but something held him back. Respect for her timing, for Claire's need to face the present before confronting the past. Could you bring me a mirror? She asked, interrupting his thoughts. Blake found a small mirror in the bedside drawer and handed it to her. Claire observed her reflection with a neutral expression, her thinner face, dull hair, pale skin. She showed no surprise or sadness, just acceptance. I came close this time, didn't I? She asked, handing the mirror back. Yes, he said, remembering the fear he'd felt. But you're strong, Claire. You always have been. A fragile smile, her first since waking, crossed her lips for a moment. I had to be. At that moment, the door opened, and a doctor walked in, followed by a nurse. They both smiled when they saw Claire awake. Ms. Bennett, good to see you awake and aware, greeted the doctor, stepping up to the bed. How are you feeling? Blake stood up, making room for the doctor to examine Claire. I'll go get some coffee while you get checked out, he said. I'll be right back. Claire nodded, and Blake left the room, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. The ice was broken, but the path ahead remained long and uncertain. Thursday. In the weeks that followed, as Claire gradually regained her strength, the dynamic among the three of them slowly evolved. After being discharged, she moved into the apartment Blake had rented, a comfortable two-bedroom place overlooking a small park. Though initially reluctant, she agreed to it after Blake explained it was only temporary, until she fully recovered and they could discuss more permanent options. Blake did not move into that apartment, keeping his own place a few blocks away, but he spent most of his time there. He hired a nurse to help Claire during the day, and every evening after picking Isla up from school, they shared dinner together. At first, those meals were quiet and awkward. Claire, still weak and processing everything that had happened, said little. Blake, anxious not to push her, stuck to safe topics: Isla's progress at school, the day's news, plans for the next meal. Sensing the tension, Isla alternated between trying to cheer them up and lapses of silent observation. But as the days passed, small changes began to appear. The first sign came one afternoon when Blake arrived to find Claire and Isla in the tiny kitchen attempting to make cookies. Flour was everywhere, and the smell of something slightly burnt lingered in the air. We're making cookies, Isla announced proudly, her face dusted with flour. But I think the first batch didn't come out so good. Claire, perched on a stool by the counter, looked tired, but had a sparkle in her eyes Blake hadn't seen in a long time. Isla insisted, she explained with a slight shrug. Apparently, cookies are essential to recovery. Absolutely, Blake agreed, playing along. I've heard that the scent of freshly baked cookies increases white blood cells by 200%. Isla laughed, a crystal sound that seemed to brighten the small apartment. You made that up? Caught me, Blake admitted, raising his hands in surrender. But it's true that cookies make everything better. May I help with the next batch? To his surprise, Claire answered, Please, it's clear we need professional supervision. That afternoon marked a subtle turning point. The ice didn't melt entirely, but it began to crack. In the following weeks, more moments like that popped up. Small islands of normalcy and even joy in a sea of uncertainties. One particularly pleasant afternoon, Blake suggested a picnic in the small park across the street. Isla loved the idea and hurried to help prepare a basket. Claire, now able to walk short distances without getting too tired, agreed after some hesitation. Sitting on a blanket under the shade of a large tree, the three of them might have appeared to any casual observer as a perfectly normal family enjoying a spring day. Isla would occasionally run off to chase squirrels or butterflies, returning to report her discoveries with childlike excitement. Blake watched Claire, who seemed more relaxed than she had been since waking in the hospital. Leaning her back against the tree trunk, She closed her eyes briefly, letting the sun filtering through the leaves play across her face. "I missed this," she said softly, not opening her eyes. "The park?" Blake asked. "Just existing without constantly fighting." She opened her eyes and looked at Isla, who was now crouched near a flower bed, studying something on the ground. Seeing her like that, carefree, being just a kid, Blake felt a knot in his throat. "She's amazing, Claire. Strong, smart, compassionate. You did an incredible job, despite everything you went through." Claire looked at him directly then, something she rarely did since her recovery. "I had no choice," she said matter-of-factly, with no bitterness. "When you have someone who depends on you completely, you find strength you never knew you had." The implication hung in the air. She had been alone, with no choice because Blake wasn't there. He wanted to say he would have helped, would have been there if he'd known. But he knew that was a fragile argument. Instead, he opted for honesty. "I'm sorry you had to do it all alone," he said simply. "I really am." Claire didn't respond immediately. She watched Isla a bit longer before speaking again. "It wasn't always terrible, you know. We had good moments. Movie nights under blankets, scavenger hunts in our apartment on rainy days, made-up bedtime stories." A small smile touched her lips. "Isla has an incredible imagination. You've probably noticed." "I have," Blake said, recalling the fantastical tales she spun. "She told me about the secret kingdom in her closet, ruled by a three-legged cat wearing a crown." Claire laughed, a sound so unfamiliar now that it almost startled Blake. "Sir Whiskers, a benevolent but demanding ruler. Apparently, only those who know the secret password, which changes weekly, are allowed in. And it always involves some kind of meow or purr," Blake added with a grin. They shared a brief moment of complicity, united by their love for the same remarkable child. For an instant, the years of separation seemed to shrink, and they were simply Claire and Blake again, as they had been before ambition and wounded pride tore them apart. But then Claire averted her gaze, and the moment passed. Silence returned, less tense than before, but still laden with everything left unspoken. Isla came running back, cupping something in her hands. "Look," she cried, opening her fingers slightly to reveal a small ladybug. "It landed on my hand because I stayed super still." "They say ladybugs are good luck," Claire said, leaning in to see the tiny red insect. "Did you know they help protect gardens? They're like little guardians." "Like knights in red armor," Blake added. Isla pondered that idea. "I guess she needs a name, then. All knights have names." "How about Lady Spot?" Blake suggested. "Or Scarlet the Brave," Claire offered. Isla shook her head at both suggestions. "I'm calling her Dottie Reddington, protector of gardens and friend of children," she declared with all the solemnity of a royal ceremony. Blake and Claire glanced at each other and burst out laughing at the same time, a genuine shared laugh that chipped away more of the tension between them. As the sun began to set, they gathered their things and headed back to the apartment. Claire, tired but visibly more cheerful than usual, insisted on helping make dinner. The three of them worked in the small kitchen, Isla washing vegetables, Claire slicing them carefully, and Blake handling the rest. The simple meal, roast chicken with vegetables and rice, was eaten amid light conversation and occasional laughter. For the first time, they caught a glimpse of what they could be as a family, if only they allowed themselves to dream it possible. Later, after Isla went to bed, Blake and Claire sat on the apartment's small balcony, watching the city lights begin to sparkle against the darkening sky. Blake handed her a cup of tea, chamomile with a hint of honey, just the way she used to like it. "Thank you," she said, accepting the cup. The word carried more meaning than simple gratitude for tea, and they both knew it. "For you and Isla, I'd do anything," he replied, settling into the chair beside her. Claire studied him over the rim of her cup as she took a sip. "You've changed," she observed quietly. Blake thought for a moment. "I think so. Or maybe I just remembered who I really am, underneath all the layers I built up over the years." "These past years haven't been kind to me," Claire said after a pause, "physically and emotionally. I have scars, Blake. Many you can't see." "I know," he said softly. I don't expect them to vanish overnight, or that a single picnic could erase years of struggle. I only hope that with time we can build something new, something good for Ela. Claire nodded, turning her gaze back to the city before them. She likes you, she said. I've never seen her connect so quickly with someone. Blake felt his heart tighten at that statement. The bond he'd formed with Isla was the most precious treasure he had now. She's extraordinary, he said, and she deserves the best we can give her. Claire didn't reply right away. When she finally did, her voice was so soft it was almost lost to the night breeze. I'm afraid, Blake, afraid to trust again, afraid to let myself believe this time could be different. The raw honesty in her confession touched Blake profoundly. It was the first time since she woke up that she'd really opened even a small window into her feelings. Your fear is justified, he acknowledged. I can't promise I'll never disappoint you again, but I can promise I'll do everything in my power to be the person you and Isla deserve. And I understand if you need time, lots of time. Claire looked at him then, really looked, as if seeing beyond the surface, beyond the successful businessman, beyond the ex-boyfriend who had hurt her. For a moment, Blake felt utterly exposed, all his flaws and fears laid bare. One day at a time, she finally said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. That's all I can offer right now. For Blake, it was more than enough. It was a beginning, a small, fragile beginning, but a real one. The start of something that, with care and patience, might grow into something beautiful and lasting. Sitting side by side on the balcony, watching the city that never sleeps, they allowed themselves, perhaps for the first time, to imagine a future different from what they'd envisioned. A future where old wounds could heal, where pride and fear wouldn't dictate their choices, where a makeshift family could find its way back to each other. A future that, despite its uncertainty, suddenly seemed possible. A month had passed since Claire's hospital discharge. Her recovery was steady, though slow. Weekly medical visits confirmed her heart was responding well to the treatment, but the doctors emphasized the need for ongoing care and the possibility of a future surgical intervention. During this period, the dynamic among the three of them had subtly transformed. Claire's initial mistrust toward Blake was gradually replaced by a reluctant acceptance of his presence in their lives. It wasn't full forgiveness or forgetting the past, but a pragmatic acknowledgement that, for now, this arrangement was best for Isla, and Isla thrived. The new school, proper medical care for her mother, and the financial stability Blake provided had freed her to simply be a child. Her smile came more easily, her stories grew more elaborate, her sleep was more peaceful. On that Sunday afternoon, the weather was particularly pleasant, one of those perfect spring days New York occasionally offers as an apology for harsh winters. Blake suggested a stroll through Central Park, and to his surprise, Claire agreed without hesitation. Isla needs some fresh air, she said simply, and so do I. They walked the winding paths of the park together, Isla running ahead, occasionally rushing back to show them an interesting leaf or a colorful stone she found. Blake and Claire followed in comfortable silence, occasionally commenting on the weather or Isla's latest discovery. When Isla stopped, enthralled by a group of ducks on one of the ponds, Blake used the moment to check on Claire. You don't have to worry so much, she said with a small smile. I'm not going to collapse in the middle of the park. Force of habit, Blake admitted. I spent a lot of sleepless nights at the hospital, hoping you'd... well, you know. Claire nodded, her gaze drifting to Isla, now trying to coax a squirrel closer with a piece of cookie she'd saved in her pocket. I never properly thanked you, she said after a moment. For everything you did for Isla while I was unconscious. Janet told me how you cancelled meetings, rearranged your entire life to look after her. It was nothing, Blake said automatically. Claire turned to look at him squarely. Don't do that, she said firmly. Don't minimize it. It was significant for Isla, and for me too. Blake felt the weight of those words. It was the first time Claire openly acknowledged the importance of his recent actions. You're welcome, he said simply. They continued walking, eventually finding a quiet spot under a large tree. Blake spread out the blanket they'd brought, and the three of them sat down to enjoy a simple picnic. Isla devoured her sandwich and apple in record time, before asking permission to explore a small area nearby, always within sight of the adults. Left alone, a different kind of silence settled, denser, filled with unspoken words. Blake noticed Claire seemed uneasy, as if gathering her courage to speak. "I've been thinking a lot," she began, eyes fixed on Isla, who was now happily piling up small stones a short distance away. "About the past, about decisions." Blake felt his heart beat faster, but kept his expression neutral. "What kind of decisions?" Claire took a deep breath. "Why I left or to start with?" It was the first time they directly addressed the subject since Claire woke up in the hospital. Blake had avoided pressing her, respecting her pace, though his curiosity and guilt burned inside him. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," he offered. "I do," she insisted, still not looking at him. "I think we both need this conversation," Blake nodded, waiting for her to continue. "I left because I didn't feel seen, much less loved," Claire said, her words now flowing more easily. "You never had time for me. You lived for your business, and I was invisible to you." The truth of her statement hit Blake hard. It wasn't anything he hadn't already known or admitted to himself in lonely nights of reflection, but hearing it directly from Claire made it more real and more painful. "After a while, I had enough," she continued. "You lived for your business, and I was invisible to you. I deserved better." "You did deserve better," Blake said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "So you deserved far more than I was willing or able to give back then?" Claire finally turned to face him. "It was never about what you could give me materially, Blake. It was never about money or expensive gifts. It was about being there, about really seeing me." Blake nodded, accepting the criticism. "I know. It took me a long time to understand that. Maybe I only truly grasped it when I saw Isla for the first time." Isla's name made Claire avert her gaze again, watching their daughter, who was now chatting enthusiastically with another child who had wandered over to admire her stone tower. "When I found out I was pregnant, you had already been in China for 2 months, Claire said, her voice quieter now. "I tried to reach you, called your office repeatedly, left messages, no reply." Blake felt sick hearing that. "My God, Claire, I swear I never got those messages. Jenkins, my assistant at the time, never said anything." Claire shrugged, as though it no longer mattered. "Maybe he screened calls from an ex-girlfriend. Or maybe you were so busy making a name for yourself that you didn't notice." The accusation was fair, and Blake didn't try to defend himself. "What happened after that?" he asked softly. "I waited a few more weeks. Then I realized I had to move on, for me and the baby. I moved to Boston, where a friend offered me a place to stay. I thought I could rebuild my life there." The idea of Claire, pregnant and alone, trying to get by in a new city, tore at Blake's heart. "I would have helped, Claire, if I'd known." "Would you really?" she asked, not angrily, just genuinely curious. "The man you were then, so consumed by ambition, would he have truly dropped everything to help a pregnant ex-girlfriend?" Blake wanted to say yes, that he would have done the right thing, but the honesty now guiding their relationship demanded more. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "I want to believe I would have, but the truth is I don't know who I was back then. Or rather, I do. I was someone obsessed with success, with approval from people who didn't really matter, someone who measured worth in dollars and cents." Claire seemed to appreciate his candor, nodding slightly. "That's why I never came back to tell you about Isla, even later on. The man I knew wasn't ready to be a father, wasn't ready to put someone else above his ambition." "And now?" Blake asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. Claire studied him for a long moment. "Now you're different. Or maybe you're who you always were, underneath all those layers. The man I saw taking care of Isla while I was in the hospital, who stayed up nights by my bedside, who rearranged his whole life without hesitation, that man could be a good father." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Blake's heart pounded. "Claire," he began, unsure how to continue. She lifted her hand to stop him. "Let me finish. There's something I need to say, something I should have said a long time ago." Blake nodded, respecting her request. Claire took a deep breath, looked once more at Isla, still lost in her own world of stones, then locked eyes with Blake, Isla is your daughter, Blake. Though he had already suspected, though all evidence pointed to it, though his heart had already accepted it, hearing those words from Claire, clear and definitive, hit him like an explosion in his chest. A flood of emotions overwhelmed him. Profound sorrow for the time lost, for the birth he never witnessed, the first steps he missed, the first words he never heard, yet also an indescribable joy for the confirmation, for Claire's explicit acknowledgement, and for the chance to finally be a real father to Isla. I knew, he managed after a moment, voice trembling. Ever since I first saw her. Those eyes, my eyes, your expression, Claire said with a small smile, and that stubbornness, all yours. Blake laughed, though tears blurred his vision. Thank you for telling me, for confirming, even if I already knew. You deserve to hear it from me, Claire replied simply. So you both deserved the truth. Blake glanced at Isla, unaware of the conversation that changed everything. Does she know? He asked. Claire shook her head. No. I was waiting for the right moment. And now I think it's time. But we need to do it together, carefully. She has so many questions about her father. She's made up so many stories. I know, Blake said softly. She's shared some with me. A comfortable silence enveloped them as they watched their daughter. There was so much to discuss, so much to plan, legal matters, housing arrangements, how and when to tell Isla. But at that moment, it felt enough just to be there, together, witnessing the miracle they had created. I'm not promising anything beyond what I've already said, Claire warned after a few minutes. One day at a time, there's a lot of history between us, a lot of pain that's still healing. I know, Blake replied, and I'm not asking for more than that. Just the chance to be present, to be the father Isla deserves, and maybe, over time, build something between us. Not necessarily what we had before, but something new, something better. Claire nodded, seeming satisfied by his answer. A new beginning, then. A new beginning, he agreed. Isla chose that moment to come running back, eyes shining with excitement. I finished my sculpture, she announced proudly. For you have to come see it. Blake and Claire exchanged a quick look, full of unspoken promises, before getting up to follow their daughter. The sculpture was a tower of stones carefully balanced to form a precarious but impressive stack that defied gravity. It's beautiful, Claire praised, kneeling down for a better view. What does it represent? Blake asked, genuinely curious. Isla looked at him as though the answer was obvious. It's our family, silly. See? This big stone at the bottom is you, because you're strong and hold everyone up. The one in the middle is Mom, because she keeps everything connected. And this small one on top is me. Blake felt his heart swell at the simplicity and depth of her explanation. Without realizing it, Isla had created the perfect representation of what they were becoming, fragile, yet with the right balance and care, able to stand firm. It's perfect, he said, voice thick with emotion. Absolutely perfect. Claire reached out and took his hand, a small gesture but significant. It was the first time since this all began that she'd initiated physical contact. They stood side by side, watching their daughter place the final pebble atop her creation. In that simple moment, under the spring sun in Central Park, as Isla proudly presented her family made of stones, something finally shifted, fully and irrevocably. It wasn't the end of their journey, not by a long shot. There was still much to heal, much to build, much to learn about one another. But it was a beginning. A beginning without empty promises or unrealistic expectations. A beginning based on truth, finally brought into the light, allowing old wounds to dry and begin to heal. Blake looked down at their joined hands, then at Isla, feeling a certainty he'd never felt before. It didn't matter how long it took or what obstacles lay ahead. This was his family, his home. Not the luxurious Park Avenue apartment, not the corporate empire he'd built, but these two people by his side. For the first time in his life, Blake Hamilton felt he was exactly where he should be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. No longer chasing a hypothetical future of wealth and power, but living fully in the present, building a future made of moments like this, imperfect, delicate, but infinitely precious. A new home, built not of bricks and mortar, but of love, redemption, and the tiny daily miracles that bind a family together.